Jesus is viewed in both Judaism and Islam. And tonight, we're going to examine ways that he has been seen in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. There are no direct references to Jesus in the classical Hindu texts, mainly because most of them came before Jesus. So we don't find reference in the classical Hindu text. But there is a doctrine in what is known as the Vaishnavite tradition. And Vaishnavite Hindus are those who worship Vishnu. It's the symbol of the god on the left. And this doctrine can easily accommodate Jesus within the tradition, and it's known as the Avatar tradition. An avatar, the word in Sanskrit means a coming down, a deliberate descent of a god into the world as a type of incarnation. So within Hindu Vaishnavite doctrine, there's this notion of the avatar. It can mean also appearance or manifestation. What's important is that the high god can take human form. So you can probably also see a bit of a connection right away. Okay? Vishnu is known as the preserver, and there are varying lists of his avatars that have appeared, and they're in a number of the sacred texts. And they come for a certain purpose. They don't just descend willy-nilly. They come to restore righteousness back to the social order or the cosmic order when that has somehow been violated. So when there is a lack of righteousness, then an avatar will come. This is a passage from the Bhagavad Gita, one of Gandhi's favorite texts, that describes the typical role of an avatar. Whenever righteousness wanes and unrighteousness increases, I, that's Vishnu, send myself forth for the protection of the good and the destruction of evil, for the establishment of righteousness. I come into being age after age. So there's been more than one avatar. In fact, the most common list is known as the DASAVATARA, 10 avatars of Vishnu, which we find in the various texts. Dash means 10. The first 7 of these, I don't know if you can see from back there, but these are more mythical figures who appeared in the ancient past and often took animal form. Now these are myths, remember. For example, there's an avatar known as the fish avatar. Matsya is his name, who saved the sacred scriptures from the demons. There's another avatar named Naharimsa, half man, half lion, who came to destroy an evil demon. So in the myths, these avatars appear to get rid of evil forces, usually personified as demons of some sort. Now, if you want to read myths more internally, that's the avatar within you can get rid of the demons within you. But most people read the myths as these events. Now, the last 3 avatars are much more what we'd call historical figures. They're not just, and they're these 3 here: Rama, Krishna, and the Buddha. So, in the Dasavatar system of Vaishnavite Hinduism, we find these famous avatars. Rama, if you've ever heard of the sacred text called the Ramayana, it's a story of Rama and how an evil demon takes his wife Sita, takes her down to Sri Lanka, and Rama and his forces go down, save her, come back, and this is the victory of good over evil. The Ramayana is a very popular text through all of Southeast Asia. If you've ever been to Southeast Asia, you may well see a Ramayana play. It's one of the common themes. Krishna was another avatar, and he comes and helps a number of brothers get rid of some evil cousins who have usurped the throne. And then, interestingly, we have the Buddha. Now, the Buddha is not Hindu. He did live in India, and he taught at a time. But Buddhism went on to develop an independent religion. But it's interesting that he could be incorporated as an avatar. And that gives us a bit of a link into how Jesus could be seen as an avatar. Because what Hinduism does, it's been its great strength, is to take something external, incorporate it, and assimilate it. Rather than just reject it openly, you take it in. It's called compartmentalization. You find a place for it, and then you allow it to exist within that compartment. It's actually a pretty good way of dealing with conflict. Rather than just, because what happened once you, okay, so the Buddha, and most scholars believe that's what happened. Buddhism was quite popular in India for a number of centuries. In fact, a major king, Ashoka, became a Buddhist. The Brahmins, the Hindu hierarchy, wanted to stop this, so the best way of doing it was, come on in and come over here. And you can be in this context. So it's much more what we call assimilating. It's been its great strength to assimilate, to bring into the fold, find a specific place for it, and then to go on. And this was, I think this is what how we can see that Jesus, for many Hindus, can be accepted. He's accepted as an avatar of Vishnu. Mention one other before we get on to some specific examples. There is a future avatar to come. There have been 9 of the 10. This is known as Kalki. This is the avatar of the future, who will end the current dark age known as the Kali Yuga, in which we are now living and existing. All religions have what is sometimes called an eschatological. You've probably heard Reverend Elbert use that term before, eschatological. These are the stories of the end times. What's going to happen at the end of the cycle. All religions have these. It's their hope for the future. No matter how bad things look now, there will be in the future something good coming out of it. So this is the Kalki that is expected at any time by many conservative Hindus, just like in the Islamic tradition, the return of the Imam Mahdi, or in the Christian tradition, the second coming of Christ. Similar sort of notion. Okay. It's a small horse. Yes, these for some. I'm not up on my horses, so. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah. But notice he has the parasol. That's always the sign of royalty. In any case, so let's now look at Jesus as avatar. So for many Hindus, Jesus, for the reasons I mentioned, can easily be incorporated into the avatar tradition. Do you note here on the right we have Jesus and Krishna holding hands. You find these sorts of posters all over India. They're kind of gaudy. They're in contrast with the really nice traditional sculpture that you find. But things like this are just all over India. You go into any shop, you'll find these. And you'll find them of Jesus hanging on a wall. And the reason, because he can be accepted as an avatar. So how do these tie in? Okay, the Christian doctrine of the incarnation meshes well with the avatar doctrine. Can you see that? Avatar means taking form. Incarnation. Second, I just mentioned, Hinduism has historically been capable of absorbing non-Hindu elements into its worldview. is the mingling, also a mingling, an avatar is a mingling of the human and the divine qualities. In Christianity it's called all God, all man, similar in an avatar. Krishna is all God from a certain perspective, but he's all man in his incarnated form. The purpose of the incarnation is the fulfillment of a divine mission. It's not just, it doesn't just happen. There has to be a reason. And that is to restore righteousness or some new order to the world and cosmos. And then perhaps just as importantly, it reveals a personal God. A God of grace. The avatars aren't these abstract, high philosophical concepts that you get in very high philosophical Hinduism. These are stories that people can relate to. These are very personal relationships to God, through Krishna, through Rama. So this personal notion that God is a God of grace. He comes into the world to save things, as it were. Yeah, Chris? These are all from the Jesus story. Yeah. Yeah, Jesus' life. But that's a Hindu poster. That's a Hindu poster of the life of Jesus. Because, like I say, many Hindus have no trouble accepting he's an avatar. He's an avatar.
What's the way the picture on my left of the music you're talking about?
This one?
Where it's live around? The sound, is there a reason why like they call them flowers? Or, you know, if we were to do something like that, I think there'd be more like maybe just a candle or maybe cross on it. Why are the styles different?
Because of the nature of Hindu worship. The method of worship called puja, which involves flowers, incense, often goodies that are given to the deity. Well, now you have an altar of Jesus as an avatar, and those are the offerings. Flowers, the gods love flowers. Yeah, okay. But good question, good question.
And now when you go to India, they give you garlands of flowers.
Yeah, garlands of flowers. Yeah. There's also, in this connection, the demonstration of the importance of ethical action in maintaining God's relationship to man and to God as well. So the avatars preach ethical doctrines. They're there to get rid of quote-unquote evil and to establish righteousness. And the physical death of the incarnated God takes place, but that does not kill his eternal essence, because Vishnu is always up there. So it's almost a little bit like the Trinity, if you will. There's God the Vishnu, God the Avatar, and God the acting spirit. These coalesce very nicely. Okay? So in Hindu, the main difference, of course, is that Hindus would say that he's not the only avatar. Okay. There have been numerous avatars. So he's not seen as the only son of God. He is an avatar. He is a son of God, if you wish, but he is one of many. And that's, again, Hinduism's great power. It can incorporate, it can bring in. And you sometimes say, don't negate, assimilate. That's the phrase. Okay, so let's look at a prime example of a Hindu, very famous Hindu, who could accept Jesus as an avatar. And this is the 19th century saint known as Ramakrishna. He was an Indian Hindu mystic, religious leader who lived in the 19th century in northeast India in the area that's now known as Bengal. near Calcutta. He approached his religious life through paths of devotion, personal devotion, as well as the notion of the unity of God, the unity of the individual soul with God. In Sanskrit, it's tattvam asi. You are that. That which is your inner, deepest soul is one with the ultimate source of the universe. That was his philosophical view. He acted that out devotionally through a number of gods and goddesses. What's important is he held that the world's religions represented, quote, so many paths to reach one and the same goal. And they're different paths to the same goal. This is how he put it. God can be realized through many paths. All the religions speak truth. The important thing is to reach the roof. You can reach it by stone stairs, wooden stairs, bamboo steps, or by a rope. You can also climb up a bamboo pole. What's important is getting to the roof, not the way you get there. So the notion that there are many paths. One should not think, he said, my religion alone is the right path and all other religions are false. God can be realized by many paths. It is enough to have a sincere yearning for God. Infinite are the paths and infinite the opinions. What's interesting is his followers came to view him as an avatar. And he's highly, highly respected and still worshipped today. When his, let me see if I have something else here. I think I have a few more quotes from him. Yeah, here, I like this one. He said, Ramakrishna made revered mentions of non-Hindu religious traditions. He also worshipped Muhammad. He found no problem with that. In 1873, this is an interesting example. After seeing a picture of the Madonna and child, he had a vision in which Jesus merged with his own body. Now this is a Hindu saint. One of his young charges had a Bible and used to read it to Ramakrishna. And he loved to hear the stories. He loved to hear the Bible stories. He became enamored with these stories, and he was given a beautiful picture of the Madonna and the Divine Child, which he kept along with his other icons and images. One day, intently watching it, he became gradually overwhelmed with emotion. It so appeared that the figures in the picture took on life, and the rays of the light emanating from them entered his soul. This is an account. He cried out, "Oh, Mother, what are you doing to me?" Jesus Christ possessed his soul and fully immersed his mind in the Christian images for 3 days. He went into deep, what is called samadhi, which is a deep meditative state for 3 days. Didn't eat, didn't drink for 3 days. And he later said that during this deep inner realization, he was one with Jesus. This is a Hindu. On the 4th day, as he was walking, he saw an extraordinary looking person approaching him with his gaze intently fixed on him. Presently the figure drew near, and from the inmost recesses of Ramakrishna's heart there came the realization: there is the Christ who poured out his heart's blood for the redemption of mankind and suffered agonies for its sake. It is none else than the master yogi. Yogin. A yogin is the master of yogic powers. Jesus, the embodiment of love. In his divine vision, the Son of Man embraced Ramakrishna and became merged with him. He later said, I look upon Jesus as an avatar, like Rama and Krishna. He had another mystical experience when he was looking at a picture that he had in his room of Jesus saving St. Peter from drowning. When asked if these experiences meant he was no longer a Hindu, which would be a good question, he replied, I remain always strong and steadfast in my own faith. But I eschew all bigotry and intolerance. Be not like the frog in the well. The frog in the well knows nothing bigger and grander than its well. Let everyone perform with faith the devotions and practices of his or her creed, but open your mind to others. So this is the idea, and we'll see this with Gandhi. Gandhi wasn't going to become a Christian. He would remain a Hindu, but he could have reverence at the deepest level for the figure of Jesus. That's something that's probably pretty peculiar to many religions. And that's again because this ability of Hinduism to compartmentalize. I don't have to push something out completely. I can take it in and see it as part of my religious experience. He had a disciple by the name of Swami Vivekananda. He became very significant because he really introduced Hinduism to the West. In 1893, there was what was known as the first Parliament of Religions, held in Chicago. Leaders from all the religions around the world came to Chicago to present their views and ideas. The purpose being the unity of religion in terms of what the planet needed at the time. What he taught was, he called it the Hindu Christ. What did he mean by the Hindu Christ? This is what he said. I pity the Hindu who does not see the great beauty in Jesus Christ's character. But I also pity the Christian who does not reverence the Hindu Christ. The Christ who is not only present in multiple incarnations, but is the divine reality in our very selves. So the Hindu Christ isn't just one figure. Multiple incarnations. But more importantly, where's the Hindu Christ? Within you. It's not some idea or fixture out here. This is Swami Vivekananda's view. A more universal Christ is in tune with the current boundary-crossing attempts at understanding amongst religions. This is what he said was needed for an understanding of different religions. Then there was this famous SHRI Aurobindo Ghosh, 1872 to 1950. He's the great teacher of what is known as integral yoga, if you've ever heard of that. Founded a famous ashram in Pondicherry, India. Pondicherry is near present Chennai in South India, what the British called Madras. He wrote, the divine manifestation of a Christ, Krishna, Buddha in external humanity has for its inner truth the same manifestation of the eternal avatar within our own inner humanity. So he's stressing the same sort of notion. These guys are mystics. They see religious truth basically within. We can talk about it as things outside, but essentially it's the spirit, I guess the term, the kingdom of God is within you. That's what they focus on, these mystics. He says, an avatar does not come as a magician, but as a divine leader of humanity and an exemplar of the divinity that is in all of us. That's the avatar's role, to show the divinity that is in all of us. The rationalist who would have cried to Christ, if thou art Son of God, come down from the cross, has missed the root of the whole matter, because he only sees things externally. And then there, of course, is Mahatma Gandhi. For Gandhi, Jesus was a great spiritual teacher, the cornerstone of whose teaching was non-violence, as expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. Gandhi saw in the symbol of the cross the loving suffering that was required of a person who would dedicate his life to nonviolence. According to his grandson, Gandhi said he believed in Jesus, but not in the God Christ. He believed the message was what was important, and not the idea of worshiping some external idol. He thought that was the easy way out. Worship, but don't do. You don't have to bear your, you don't have to bear your cross. You let someone else bear it for you. This was, Gandhi said, he thought that was a type of spiritual cop-out, you might say. He said, in the future, people will follow me in life and worship me in death, but not make my cause their cause. This is the problem, he said, of all religions. The external becomes more important than the actual teaching or the way. And we should remember that early Christians were not called Christians. They were called followers of the way. According to the well-known American missionary Dr. Stanley Jones, and this is interesting, never has so much light been shed upon Christ's message as by this one man. And that man, not even a Christian. Had not our Christianity been overlaid by our identification with unchristian attitudes and policies in public and private, we would have seen at once the kinship between Gandhi's methods and the cross. There were many attempts made to convert Gandhi. He said, I am a Hindu, but I admire Jesus. He didn't quite go as far as some of the others in this avatar tradition. He was a little more of a practical person. He said, what's important is the way. And that's exemplified in the life of Jesus. And that's what a Christian should attempt to follow, even when it means suffering. Not even, probably, most likely. And crucifixion is crucifixion, after all. So let me just give you a couple of his quotes, and then we'll move on. These are some of the things he said. I have regarded Jesus of Nazareth as one amongst the mighty teachers that the world has had. I shall say to the Hindus that your lives will be incomplete unless you reverently study the teachings of Jesus. I know of no one who has done more for humanity than Jesus. In fact, there is nothing wrong with Christianity. The trouble is with Christians who do not live up to their own teachings. Though I cannot claim to be a Christian in any sectarian sense, the example of Jesus' suffering is a factor in the composition of my undying faith in nonviolence, which rules all my actions. He saw Jesus as the primary example of that. Okay, before we move to Hinduism, Buddhism, yes, I want to mention this something. Referred to as, or sometimes thought of, did Jesus go to India? Sometimes referred to as the lost years. This concern, you ever notice in the Gospels, you have the birth, then you have the temple experience as a young boy, and then the next thing you know, he's in his 30s. What happened in between? And the human mind, being what it is, often likes to fill that up, and a number of theories developed concerning Jesus's time during where he was said to have gone to India. Several authors have claimed to have found proof of the existence of manuscripts in India and Tibet that support the belief that Jesus was in India during this time. Not impossible. Not impossible. People did travel, and there are lots of connections. The Jesus in India manuscript was first reported in modern times by one Nicholas Notovich. He was a Russian war correspondent who visited India and Tibet in 1897. He claimed that at a monastery in Ladakh, which is in Tibet, he learned of a manuscript entitled The Life of Saint Isa, Best of the Sons of Men. Isa is the Arabic name for Jesus. So, and then there was additional texts that were created in let me see if I can get here, by Elizabeth. Yeah, what's her name? What's her? Yeah, and she again using that. Somehow there are these manuscripts. The problem is for historians that these manuscripts are not available. We have to depend on the oral traditions, which have, see, these books here are secondary sources. They're not the original manuscripts. These are accounts of what people said they saw or heard about, which is always a bit problematic for a historian. The historian wants some original documentation. But it became a very common theme for many years that Jesus had visited India and that there was a definite connection between Indian spirituality and early Christianity. Just thought I'd mention that to you. Okay. Yeah, Thomas, they said, yeah, it's much more likely that Thomas went to India because we have early churches in Goa and on the West Coast related to Thomas. And, you know, stories can get mixed up, too, about Thomas. So, in any case, if you're interested, you can pursue it. Okay, let's turn to Jesus in Buddhism. Anyone recognize this gentleman? This is the Dalai Lama. When the Dalai Lama was asked what his attitude towards Jesus was, he said, "For me, as a Buddhist, my attitude toward Jesus Christ is that he was a bodhisattva of a very high spiritual realization." Now, since Buddhism is traditionally non-theistic, not gods, it doesn't believe in avatars or the incarnations of a god, but it does have a category of bodhisattva. So I know what your question is. What is a bodhisattva? Okay, well, let's see if I can explain. In early Buddhism, the term bodhisattva referred to the Buddha himself. In early Buddhism, the early text. Specifically in one of his earlier incarnations. Buddhism, like Hinduism, believes in reincarnation. The Buddha wasn't the first Buddha and won't be the last. So there are stories about his earlier incarnations in which he is referred to as a bodhisattva. In fact, there's a whole wonderful genre of literature known as the Jataka tales, which are stories of Buddha, often in animal form, with very moralistic, and you know what those became known as in the West? Aesop's fables. The Jataka tales traveled culturally and became, and if you read those, there are a lot of animal stories in those. Yeah? Well, in Buddhism, like for example, there's a wonderful story about Buddha when he was incarnated as a deer and sacrificed his life to a hunter who was going to kill a young doe. So this notion of sacrifice was always there. So this is what earlier on bodhisattva meant. But over the centuries, there developed within Buddhism a basic split. The latter was known as Mahayana Buddhism. Maha means great, yana means vehicle. So Mahayana was the greater vehicle. This was the greater vehicle because it offered salvation for all. Earlier Buddhism was very strict. You had to more or less be a monk who spent his life in a monastery in deep meditation to get off of this wheel called samsara. So it was very individualistic in many ways. Your goal was to get off the wheel of samsara. You did that through personal effort and discipline and following the teachings of the Buddha. But over time, many Buddhist leaders thought that this was kind of self-centered, interestingly enough. All you're interested in is your own salvation. Or your own liberation is probably a better word. So they developed the idea of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva was one who got to that point where they could leave this cycle and go into nirvana, be liberated, be free, be one with the universe, but said no. I'm not going until all of you can come with me. So I will stay, and I will give a life of service and sacrifice so that all of us can get on the Mahayana, the big boat of liberation. Do you see the difference there? So for Mahayana, the bodhisattva, his highest ideal is compassion, not his own self-interested salvation, or her. Well, it was basically his at that point. There were Buddhist nuns early on. So this is a major switch. And this is the figure who has the possibility for their own individual liberation, but says no. The idea of sacrifice for the others. And so this developed over time, and we have some interesting mythological examples. Here's just a couple images of various. There are lots of bodhisattvas, just like there are lots of saints in Catholicism. Has anyone heard of Kwan Yin? She's perhaps the most well-known bodhisattva in the West. These are two images taken from our house. The story was she was a Chinese princess whose father wanted her to be wealthy and marry a great prince. And she said, no, I want to go into a monastery. And the story goes, her father tried to do everything he could to prevent that, even to try and kill her at one point. She goes into the monastery. She gets to the point of reaching nirvana. And she says what? No. 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 I will not leave. In fact, here are the words that are usually, never will I seek nor receive private, individual salvation Never will I enter into final peace alone, but forever and everywhere will I live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world from the bonds of conditioned existence. Talk about a goal. Okay. Now, this is the ideal. No one's ever going to really live up to it. But if you can measure your values by the sense of your ideals, that means you're always striving to help others, because there's always going to be a need for help. So when the Dalai Lama is saying that he saw Jesus as a bodhisattva, he's saying he saw him as the enlightened one who was willing to sacrifice all for others. Ultimate in compassion. That's what a bodhisattva is. And this is not a new view. As far back as the 14th century, the Zen master Gassen Joseki, he was quoting Jesus. You may know this passage. Why take care for clothes? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. And then he added, whoever uttered those words, I consider an enlightened man. And who's uttered those words? Jesus. Yeah. See, and what's behind all that? The notion of don't worry about self. Don't worry about self. Worry about others. The more you worry about self, the more you're going to suffer. The self is the biggest problem. In fact, there's a famous Buddhist saying, no self, no problem. There's also been long speculation concerning a possible connection between the images of Jesus and the Buddha. If you look at their lives and compare them, very interesting comparisons. It's often pointed out that during the period in which the Gospels were composed, there was a large Buddhist community in Alexandria, Egypt, which meant that there would have been very close connection of ideas. Some scholars suggest that the images of both Buddha and Jesus feed off of one another's traditions. That you sort of had an amalgamation of ideas that came together. For example, the Orientalist Samuel Beale asserted the story of the Buddha's miraculous birth, he has a miraculous birth, was well known in the Greco-Roman world and perhaps mingled with the stories about Jesus' birth. According to Buddhist tradition, his mother, Queen Maya, came to bear the Buddha after receiving a prophetic dream in which she saw the descent of the Buddha to be from heaven into her womb. This parallels, of course, the story of Mary and the angel Gabriel. Buddha's virgin birth under a tree surrounded by animals parallels the gospel accounts, especially in Luke. The British Buddhist Arthur Lillie thought that the story of Jesus' disputation with the learned scholars in the temple matched perfectly with stories of the Buddha who did the same. So, which one influenced the other? But it is quite stunning that these stories of these two are very familiar. So in the 20th century, we have a number of Christian monastics, including the famous Thomas Merton, I don't know the Catholic, Wayne Teasdale, and the former nun Karen Armstrong, who's become a well-known author of numerous religious texts. And Buddhists such as Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist, the Dalai Lama, have become involved in what they call Buddhist-Christian dialogue. They each see in the teachings of both Jesus and the Buddha a basic commonality of insight and purpose, which offers the possibility of a profound remedy for an ailing world. If we look at the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha and could apply them to the world today, things would be much different. Yeah. Now, both Buddhism and Christianity can come together in many ways. They have their different focuses. But often what is said about Buddhism is what people read about Buddhism. If you go see the way Buddhism is practiced in Tibet, it's very devotional. It's not just a philosophy. Okay? But I know what you're saying because that's how Buddhism is often presented to the Western educated, okay, and many practitioners of Buddhism here. But Buddhism is a big tent, just as Christianity is a big tent. In fact, and I should say this, I usually do, I don't believe in there's a Buddhism, I don't believe that there's a Christianity, I don't believe there's an Islam. I believe there are Buddhisms. I believe there are Christianities. I believe there are Islams. Which is the real Christianity of the 30,000 denominations? And how are you going to decide? Okay? So you have to look at the big tent. You can see in Christianity from very literal to some of the highest philosophical, mystical theology you'll ever find. Same in Buddhism, same in Hinduism. These are big tent religions, and that's why they've survived. If you only feed a certain element, you're not going to survive very well. You'll be a small little group that'll eventually.
Donna and Ra is Taiwanese. She was raised in Taiwan as a Buddhist. She went to a Catholic high school.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and they merged very closely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course now she's converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
But that's how. And she said, you know, Mom, there's not a big difference between Christ's teachings of love and the Buddha's
Yeah. Just read them. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, this is a wonderful book. This is a wonderful book. It's by Marcus Borg, who was a well-known Protestant theologian, called Jesus, Buddha, the Parallel Sayings. This is, if you want to look at the comparison, he just sets them down next to each other, and they're very similar. There are examples of conversion. I've done a lot of work in my doctorate was based on conversion studies in India, and there are a myriad ways and reasons people convert. We tend to think of conversion as the Pauline experience, you know, on the road to Damascus, boom. That's not how most conversions actually work. In fact, some conversions have political, economic, social variables that tie in. So again, conversion itself is a big tent. It's a big tent. I think what these people are trying to do is, it doesn't matter so much what you call yourself. It's who you are, how you act, how you treat the world in which you live. The great historian of world culture, Arnold Toynbee, speculated that in centuries to come, the encounter between Christianity and Buddhism might come to be seen as the most momentous event of the 20th century. Now, we look. Sometimes the most momentous events aren't understandable until you're much further down the line. Okay. But he saw that the possibility of these two merging together, bringing East and West together in a common spirituality, was the hope for mankind. And he thought that if we get that far, we'll look back and see this as one of the momentous. I want to just finish up with, there's a very famous school of philosophy in Kyoto, Japan. It comes out of Kyoto University. there's been an attempt to assimilate Western thought, including all the various, you've heard Reverend Kim mention Christologies. A Christology is the way you understand Jesus, and there's been more than one in the history of Christianity. How to bring those together with certain Zen Buddhist ideas. There's been a great deal of intellectual effort. And one approach has been to compare the Buddhist notion of what is known as shunyata, or emptiness, with Jesus' complete emptying of self on the cross. Jesus as the ultimate example, if you will, of a Zen philosophical notion of emptiness. He empties himself completely, gives himself completely on the cross. That is emptiness, which is held in very high esteem in Zen Buddhism. Because when you're empty, there's no ego. When you're empty, there's no ego. And ego is seen as the basic source of suffering. So this school has done a lot of work. I'm going to read a passage to you. It might sound contradictory, and that's good, because that's what Zen Buddhism is all about. These are things called koans. Have you ever heard of the koan? What's the sound of one hand clapping? You ever? Okay. Okay. These are, in Zen Buddhist tradition, students would be given these little problems. The point is to eventually realize there's no rational answer to that. And the point being that rational reason is not always the best way to understand something. Sometimes something's just more intuitively grasped. You intuitively know something rather than try to figure it out just intellectually. So if I read this last passage, you might see this koan notion here. This comes from a man by the name of MASAO, a great Zen Buddhist philosopher from Kyoto University. First, although Christ existed in the form of God, that is, was the same divine nature as God, he refused to dwell in the glory which belonged to God. Okay. Instead, he abdicated his divine rank and assumed the form of a servant. You see, once you have the rank of a god, you have automatically separated yourself, whether you recognize it or not. So they're saying Jesus was this, metaphysically, but he willfully abandoned that. He self-emptied his godhood, if you will, so that he could become a suffering servant. This is the notion in Christianity of the suffering servant. Christ reveals God's unconditioned love, unconditioned, beyond any discriminatory sense of justice. Justice is always going to do what? It's always going to discriminate. That doesn't mean we can't live by justice. But as Martin Luther said, you want to live by justice? Okay, let's have it. Most people, if they are put up, if you look at your life completely in terms of justice, not only what you have done, but what you should have done, you're going to fall very far short. Therefore, don't ask totally. God is just, but he is also compassionate. That's what we call grace in the Christian tradition. Christ reveals God's unconditional love. Consequently, we may reformulate the doctrine of Christ's, what's called kenosis in Greek, as follows. Now, this is the koan. The Son of God is not the Son of God, for he is essentially and fundamentally self-emptying. Precisely because he is not the Son of God, he is truly the Son of God. Now, okay, but you see what it's trying to say? What he's saying is that Son of God is the self-emptying. It's not the notion of a powerful being. If that's what he claimed to be only, God, okay, so by denying that, he becomes that. It's sort of a paradox, but that follows the Zen tradition. Do you know what we find, especially in Hinduism, is something we call perspectivism, which means that things are seen from different perspectives in different contexts. The famous example of that is the story of the blind man and the elephant. You probably heard that. Okay, a number of blind men are asked to describe an elephant. One walks up, feels the trunk, describes it. And then it goes on. They all describe it from their own perspective because they're all limited. Even if we looked at this room, if I asked you all to describe this room from where you're sitting, you would have different descriptions. Don would say, or I would say Don was in front of me. Someone would say, no, he's in back of him. Or the story where the two groups are going to Varanasi, the holy city. The group coming from the south sees a sign that says Varanasi to the north. The group coming from the north says a sign Varanasi to the south. Well, is Varanasi to the north or to the south? It depends on your perspective. Okay? So these religions do take, and my premise is that religions that lack some sense of perspective